Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, the third in our Teacher Effectiveness series. Today's webinar topic is the use of student surveys to monitor teacher effectiveness, and this is being hosted by the Regional Educational Laboratory of the Mid-Atlantic. In order to minimize disruptions throughout the webinar, we'll now be muting the line. I'm Elizabeth Greniger, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. I'm a Managing Associate at EdCount, which is a partner with ICF International in planning and hosting this series of webinars for the REL Mid-Atlantic. Our featured presenter today is Dr. Ronald Ferguson from Harvard University. Now let's go over the agenda for today. I've just welcomed you to the webinar, and next you'll hear from the REL Mid-Atlantic Director, Teresa Duncan, who will tell you via video a little bit about REL Mid-Atlantic and give you some more information on the webinar series. Then I'll introduce our presenter, and he'll spend about an hour talking about some valuable information related to student surveys. Once his presentation concludes, we'll open up for questions from the audience, and Dr. Ferguson will respond. Finally, we'll conclude with some final thoughts on the topic and wrap up by 5 o'clock Eastern Time. To guide you through the webinar session, the agenda will remain posted on the left side of the screen below the speaker photo. At this time, we'll see a video from that will provide an overview of the RELs.
Welcome to today's REL Mid-Atlantic webinar. REL Mid-Atlantic serves Delaware, the District of Columbia, Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. As you probably know, the Regional Educational Laboratories, or RELs, are part of the Institute of Education Sciences, the research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. Our primary mission is to form research alliances with educators and policymakers to help states and school districts use research results to answer important questions about education policy and practice. Our services include direct research and technical assistance products and services. This webinar falls into the category of technical assistance, which includes bridge events, trainings, workshops, how-to guides, and white papers. Through webinars like this one, we hope to reach educators who are interested in but are unable to attend our live bridge events. Our goal for the webinar series is to provide an online space for conversation where you can work with experts and with your colleagues on the education challenges that you care about. At the end of each session, we'll ask you to rate us by completing a brief survey. Your input is important and will help us to better serve your needs.
So the Teacher Effectiveness webinar series is intended to provide stakeholders in the Mid-Atlantic with opportunities to discuss topics in the field of teacher effectiveness. One of the goals of the series is to increase participants' understanding and use of research-based teacher effectiveness strategies. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ronald Ferguson. He's a senior lecturer in education and public policy at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the Harvard Kennedy School. He's an economist and senior research associate at the Malcolm Weiner Center for School Policy. His research centers on racial achievement, and he also faculty chairs and directs the Achievement Gap Initiative at Harvard University. And most relevant to the we'll have today is that Ron is the founder of the Tripod Project for School Improvement. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ron Ferguson.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here with you this afternoon to talk about work that I've been doing for a little over 13 years, I suppose. This work grew out of consulting work that I was doing in Shaker Heights, Ohio, that was aimed at trying to learn more about what students were experiencing in the classroom. And we, among other things, decided to put together a survey that would focus on student engagement, in other words, their own self-reports of their own behaviors and thoughts in the classroom, in addition to their perceptions of instruction, what they were experiencing instructionally in the classroom. That work spread to the Minority Student Achievement Network over the early 2000s and then spilled out and has now been used pretty much all over the country and even in Canada, and we're starting some work even outside of the country. The attention came to the project that led to today's event primarily through the Gates Foundation's project on measures of effective teaching. And that has helped to provide validation and evidence of reliability for the project. And so my collaborators and I at Cambridge Education are now very busy working with school districts on the use of the tripod surveys, both for professional development and for teacher evaluation. And I should emphasize that the initial purpose was very much for school improvement and to inform professional development. The focus on evaluation is much more recent. Let me tell, who's managing the slides? I'm seeing the poll audience on my screen right now.
Ron, I'm going to just do the quick poll to see who's joining us today. Thank you for that quick overview of your presentation. Let's just see who's joining us. We're going to see a poll pop up. Looks like we have a great mix of some district folks, some state folks, and some researchers. I think that everyone who's participating today will really get a lot out of the information Ron has to share.
Okay, can we advance the slide? Elizabeth, is this the one that I narrate?
Yep, this is all you, Ron. So.
All right. Okay, so as I said earlier, we're going to talk about the tripod surveys today. The comments I made a few minutes ago said something about the evolution. This has really grown in a very natural and organic way out of my work with school districts. Actually, the first version of the survey was very much a collaboration with teachers and administrators in Shaker Heights, Ohio. And we've continued to be very interactive as we have developed the surveys over the years. The focus is both what we call the 7 C's of effective instruction, which is students' perceptions of teaching and their experience of teaching, but in addition to that, student engagement, as I was saying, the ways that they are behaving and feeling and thinking when they're sitting there experiencing instruction. We're going to talk about how the 7 C's of effective teaching predict both student engagement and their value-added achievement gains. And those predictive relationships are both aspects of what we mean when we talk about validity or validation of the surveys. We'll talk, the research supporting the surveys to this date is very much the MET research, although there's been a little bit others that I'll talk about too. The main value of the surveys is for understanding student perspectives, and teacher surveys also cover teacher perspectives, on what they're experiencing. Each of us in any particular organizational setting only have our own experience to go on, and often we're guessing about what other people are experiencing, and surveys can help us to not have to guess so much, to get more direct report from the other people whose experiences we want to understand. At the end, I'll talk about a few things to keep in mind to put surveys in context, and I'll remind you about the relationships of what surveys can tell us to some of the assumptions we tend to make and the ways we tend to talk and think about teaching and learning. I'm trying to advance the screen. Whoever needs to hand that over to me. Okay, there it is. That button. Okay. So the origins I've talked about as we've gone along. So I'm going to do that and just jump over. Again, since for about the last 10 years, the surveys have been operated by Robert Ramsdell. He's the guy who does most of the interactions logistically with schools and districts that are using the surveys. He joined Cambridge Education around 2007, and since then Cambridge Education has been managing the implementation. They are an employee-owned firm that's based in England. They operate in about 45 countries and are expanding around the U.S., supporting school improvement efforts. They're best known for school inspections, but delivering of the tripod surveys is now one of the main things that they also do at Cambridge Education. The uses are many. Teachers receive their individual reports so that they have their own report of what students in their classroom said. Usually the first 2 or 3 times through, or at least the first one time through, it's typically confidential, so only the teacher gets a report from their own classrooms. Their supervisors, their coaches don't see it, so the teachers have a chance to begin responding and trying to improve before other people know what's coming out of their classrooms. So teachers being able to improve is one purpose. Leaders get, even when they don't get the individual teacher reports, they get a profile of what's happening at the entire school in a way that's useful to inform the setting of professional development priorities and other aspects of school planning. Coaches and mentors can use them, and obviously higher education institutions also in teacher training programs. We're just beginning the conversations. We've worked with one higher education institute to adapt the survey for use of student teachers, and we expect that there's a lot more of that coming down the line. But all this is to say that there are uses for each stakeholder group in the school community, and we've actually learned a fair amount about the timing of sharing teachers' classroom level results, when you want to make them confidential, when you don't. We find that teachers tend to appreciate the results, and they tend to be most just concerned that the data and the results are used in ways that are fair and supportive to teachers. And as long as it's fair and supportive and teachers have opportunities to respond and improve, we find a great deal of receptivity. There are 3 levels of surveys, and within each level we have a standard survey, then we have a shorter survey, then we have a really short survey. You get the most bang for the effort by really doing the standard survey, which has the full battery of both the 7 C's classroom instructional measures, and in addition, the student survey measures. There are also some student background measures that we can use to investigate the degree to which students from different backgrounds are experiencing instruction differently or responding to instruction differently. And then we have a few items that are about the entire school culture that we can use to distinguish schools from one another. The survey for grades K2 is a simple survey. The answers are yes, maybe, and no. It's administered in a small group of 4 or 5 kids with 1 adult. And it's pretty amazing how systematic the response patterns are, even from the kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd graders. The 3 to 5 survey is a bit longer, more age-appropriate language, and then the 6 to 12 covers both middle school and high school. And again, there's lots to be learned from each level of this. This on the screen is an example of what the upper elementary and secondary survey looks like. The items are on just down the page, as you see here, and the responses are on a 5-level Likert scale, from totally true to totally untrue. For the early elementary, as I was saying, it's just a yes, maybe, and no. And these are all machine scored, and a line anywhere, even a kid who's got really sloppy penmanship, as long as there's a line anywhere through the bubble, the machine will pick it up. We also administer these online, and there tends to be no difference at all in response patterns if you do it online or on paper. The paper is more frequently used just because most schools don't have the capacity to get all their students through the computer lab. Places that have easier universal access to computers will be the places that tend more frequently to do the online version, but it really doesn't matter much. It takes about 20 minutes to do the full version, give or take 5 minutes or so for most students, and the shorter versions take less than that. The little kids, the early elementary, can take a little harder if it's harder to sit them down and get them focused. That can be more like half an hour, but even there, it ranges depending upon how systematically organized people are to get it done. And again, we tend to coach folks on that since we've had a fair amount of experience with it. This, just a statement from Randall Sampson, who is an assistant principal at one of the places we've worked. It just talks about the idea that the data really help you see into the classroom to understand both student motivation and the learning environment and how those are related to one another. Pittsburgh, I'm reminded as I say that, has actually done some video work having their own teachers talk about it so that other teachers in the district can see and understand and become more comfortable. And so as we go on, I think there's going to be more and more educators in the districts are actually using these data that will produce their own testimonials and their own work to build support over time. Now, as I was saying earlier, the project grew out of, actually it was a week-long summer institute in Shaker Heights, Ohio in, I believe it was 2000 or 2001 school year. And the approach we took was to talk initially about an instructional tripod where in order to be effective, teachers need to understand what it is they're teaching. That's the content knowledge. They need pedagogic skill to be able to deliver that content knowledge to students in ways that students can understand. And they need relationship building skills in order to be able to connect with students so that students are not afraid to ask questions and want to help to keep the class orderly. And we unbundle these corners of the tripod into what we call the tripod 7 C's. But the way we actually spent our time in that first summer workshop in Shaker Heights was focusing on a framework to think about student engagement. And we used Erik Erikson's first 5 stages of identity development to organize our conversation that day. And that sort of took on a life of its own. People organized over the next year to build in a whole set of activities built around the student engagement piece of this. The window on your screen now, you'll see the tripod at the bottom with the arrow pointing up to the 7 C's and an arrow pointing across to student engagement. Those student engagement targets is how we talked about student engagement, and they parallel Erik Erikson's first 5 stages of identity development. And thinking about how those same concepts apply in the classroom turns out to be a pretty interesting exercise that I won't talk completely through right now. But that's really where we started, and the question was, how do the things that teachers do affect the ways that students respond in terms of being trustful and cooperative and ambitious and diligent and developing a sense of efficacy. Over time, we've also developed another way of framing the student engagement thinking and work. And so now we've got 2 different ways to come at it, either through these 5 things that you see on the screen that came out of Erikson's framework, or through another approach that I'll talk a little bit more about later. Turns out either approach takes us down to exactly the same items on the survey. And when we get down to the indices that combine small groups of items to capture particular sub-concepts, it's exactly the same concepts and exactly the same survey items, no matter whether we use the way that's presented on the screen now or the other way that I'll talk about to address student engagement. Either way, the 7 C's of effective teaching help us to understand what it is that that educators do, that teachers do in the classroom to affect student engagement and to affect student achievement outcomes. The idea is that the combination of what teachers do and what students do, the 7 C's and the engagement targets, are what produces the student engagement, student achievement outcomes, which where value-added achievement gains are the main way folks are thinking about that these days. But I'll mention that we also care about whether students are inspired to want to go to college, whether they enjoy being in the classroom, and so that there are other affective outcomes and things that have to do with life planning and so on. And we also care about high school completion, not just test scores. The 7 C's capture most of what people talk about when they talk about what effective teaching is. I actually challenge people to identify any effective aspect of instruction that can't be understood as fitting within one or more of the 7 C's. We talk about the C's in 2 groups here. The top 5 we call support, and the other 2 we call press. The distinction is that press entails really, and to some degree, working against resistance. When we're working hard, often we get tired. We want to kind of give up, and being pushed and challenged not to give up and to keep going is a form of press. Having a teacher ask students to sit still and complete their work when they feel like chatting is a form of press. Inside, you'll see number 6 on the screen here, challenging students. We have items that get at student effort, perseverance, and rigor. It's working hard and thinking hard. And those things in combination with having a culture of peer support and cooperation and staying busy and on task are what we group together under press. So really challenge and control. Then support are activities or interactions that don't entail stress, or at least low levels of stress in the same way that challenge and control might, but instead they are assisting students in ways that students will typically welcome. So communicating to students that they actually matter to the teacher as human beings, the encouragement, the emotional support is what we mean by care in this particular framework. And I should emphasize that that sense of caring that we use when we frame the surveys is a more narrow sense of what educators might sometimes mean. A teacher who cares enough to not let a student give up is one who is challenging the student. And that aspect of care, for example, would be captured here under challenge. A teacher who cares a lot, cares enough to thoroughly master their teaching and to understand the ways that students think, so that that teacher has 3, 4, 5 different ways of explaining things that students find difficult. That's a teacher who's really worked hard at clarifying lessons. So that aspect of caring might be captured under clarify. So we could tell stories about caring that could be captured under each of the 7 C's. In this particular case, the one that we label caring is more the emotional support aspect of the dynamic. Captivate is what you would think it is, making the learning fascinating, interesting, stimulating. Conferring is interacting with students to elicit their point of view, to invite their feedback, to ask them to reason their way through things in aloud so that there's actually interaction and more discourse, debate in the classroom. Clarify is about making particularly the things that are more difficult to understand more transparent. It requires having multiple explanations. It may require the teacher actually putting some time in to understand why students are making the mistakes that they're making so that the responses can be targeted. And consolidate is about summarizing, checking for understanding, pulling it together, integrating, making it seem all coherent to help students to hold it in their heads and really memorize it and encode it in memory. But it also, the checking for understanding part also is about the teacher making sure that the students are actually following along. And remember, when we were first starting this work, Mark Freeman, the superintendent in Shaker Heights, would remind teachers, if the students didn't learn it, you didn't teach it. So the consolidation, checking for understanding, is to make sure that you actually taught it and not that you just stood in front of a group of students and talked about something. So the examples of survey questions in the 7 C's on the page here. My teacher tries to understand how students feel about things. Captivate. I often feel this class has nothing to do with real life outside of school. So that's a negatively worded item. We have both positively worded and negatively worded items. The one advantage of including at least some negatively worded items is that we can check to be sure that students are actually reading the questions and not just goofing off and just checking things down one column, for example. We should be able to look in and see that the patterns is such that the patterns for the positively worded items should be the opposite of those for the items that are negatively worded covering the same topic. So we've got, for at least several of the 77 C's, 1 or 2 questions that are reverse coded like this that turn out to be very useful to check that students are taking the survey seriously, and there are a few other ways that we can check that too. Confer, teacher giving time to explain ideas, clarifying, having several good ways to explain things. Consolidate, taking time to summarize. Challenge, teacher wants us to use our thinking skills, not just memorize things. Control, the class stays busy, doesn't waste time. So these are examples, and each of these C's is represented by somewhere between 3 and 7 items typically on the survey. The early elementary survey, some are only represented by a couple. There's currently 17 items that capture the 7 C's on that survey, and we may drop a couple of those. We may be down to 14 or 15. But we have multiple ways of measuring each one, and we're able to do reliability estimates, measures to confirm that that these things really do hang together. And more recently, we've been using reliability measurement methods that take into account the randomness that may seep in at multiple levels. So we're using multi-level reliability measures and getting good results with these. So
thanks, Ron. Yeah, it's been really fascinating, I think, for everyone to hear about the background of the Tripod Project, and especially the 7 C's and how those are some key domains to look at teacher effectiveness. So now we want to just take a breather and let the participants consider what they've heard so far and answer the poll that's on the screen. There will be a poll box popping up, and we're interested in hearing from you all about which of the 7 C's you think is the strongest predictor of value-added learning gains. So based on what you just heard, which 7 C do you think would be the strongest predictor?
And I'll tell you the answer after you do it.
Started out with a tricky question.
Looks like some people are changing their minds.
Okay, so Ron, are you ready to give us the answer? And
yes, I am. Interesting pattern. Nobody voted for confer, nobody voted for consolidate, and nobody voted for control. Nobody got it right. And this is a typical pattern that we get when I ask this question to audiences. Actually, care is the one that usually wins, sometimes by a wide margin. The strongest predictor of value-added achievement gains is actually control. Remember, control is whether students are behaving themselves, whether the class is staying busy. Actually, the example of the question we looked at a second ago, if I go back a screen, the control, our class stays busy and doesn't waste time. That's one of the very strongest predictors of value-added achievement gains. And then whether people are being cooperative and respectful in the classroom, turns out to be important. And actually, I'm doing a paper right now where I'm combining the Gates Foundation Measures of Effective Teaching data from the Tripod 7 Cs with data from Charlotte Danielson's domains 2 and 3. And even for the Danielson framework for teaching, the managing student behavior is the strongest predictor of value-added achievement gains. The second strongest predictor in the Tripod framework is challenge. So I think challenge, about 31% of people on the poll a second ago voted for challenge. And that is the second strongest predictor. And you'll note that challenge and control are the two indices that we call press. So it appears that academic press is a stronger predictor of achievement gains than academic support. But the question is, what produces academic press? And we find that the strongest predictors of control, if you take the C's and use the C's to predict one another, clarify is the strongest predictor of how much control a class has. And a combination of clarify, challenge, captivate, and confer, all of those help to predict how orderly and under control the classroom is. So having a classroom that's under control is not necessarily having a teacher who treats the classroom as if the teacher were a drill sergeant. It's really teaching in a way that causes the classroom to be under control, and having some additional classroom management skills helps. But the approaches that we need to take to improving both challenge and control involves the other C's. The other C's kind of, to some degree, work through these two indices in addition to having some direct effect on their own. So let's keep going. The classroom learning conditions frame in Tripod includes both the 7 C's framework and some attention to peer support. It turns out that there are some aspects of student engagement that are very sensitive to how much teasing there's going on, for example, in the classroom, particularly help avoidance. Students will tend to avoid seeking help if they fear that there's going to be teasing in the classroom. They also tend to hold back from appearing to work hard. They will hide effort. So the teasing variables tend to be pretty interesting as predictors of other aspects of classroom engagement. The second student engagement framework that I mentioned earlier is what I've got on the screen now. There are two major domains here, academic and social. The academic aspects of engagement are very much responses to instruction and are affected a lot by what the teacher's doing. The social aspects of engagement are affected to some degree by what the teacher's doing, but they're also affected substantially by the peer culture that the students bring in from outside of the classroom. And the degree to particularly teasing is important there. So on each side of this, we distinguish goals and behaviors. So you'll see the larger orange and green boxes on each side of the screen. We distinguish goals and behaviors from beliefs and feelings that are on the bottom side of the screen. And for each of those, we have 3 or 4 sub-indices. So, and I probably should not try to take time to talk through each of these. The titles on them are fairly self-evident. For example, on goals and behaviors, the distinction between effort and persistence is effort is where the students typically push themselves hard to try to understand things, whereas persistence is whether they tend to give up in the face of difficulty. And so you can have a student who usually works hard and pushes themselves hard, but as soon as things get stressful or difficult, they kind of back off and give up. So it's useful to distinguish effort from persistence. Mastery is whether students are focused on really understanding and not worrying about what their grades are so much, but they really just want to deeply understand material. Help-seeking is about asking for help when you need it. And it turns out help-seeking is not exactly the opposite of help avoidance. On the other side of the screen, on the right side, next to goals and behaviors, you'll see the third down, it says not avoiding help. And help avoidance is strongly predicted by teasing, whereas help-seeking tends to be more related to clarify. And so if the students think that the teacher is going to give an effective, clear answer, they're more inclined to want to seek help. And you can imagine that the help-seeking and help avoidance are related but somewhat in tension. You can imagine interesting classrooms where there's teasing going on, but you've got a teacher who's really great at explaining things, and the kids would be naturally feeling some tension in whether to ask for help or not. So you can come back to the PowerPoint and read back through these and think about them. But if you think about combining the student engagement metrics with the 7 Cs, it's easy to imagine being able to put together the story of each classroom. And our aspiration with this work is to get to the place where we've got lots of materials that help teachers understand what type of classroom they have and what some of the most important ways of improving are. We've got some of those kinds of things, but the development of that stuff is accelerating now, and there's huge potential. The shorter versions of the surveys tend to have fewer of the engagement measures in them, and they might be 5 minutes faster or 7 minutes faster to complete, but places really lose out on the richness of the student engagement information when they do the shorter surveys and are not able to put together the same type of detailed story of the classroom. And so teachers don't get quite as rich a sense of what things are and what things could be if the efforts are made to change. So I'll hand the ball back to Elizabeth for a second.
Sure. So hearing a little bit more about student engagement pushes us to ask a question about the student perspective. So here we're going to show one poll and then another poll, the first of which is going to ask, which of the 7 Cs do you think most strongly predict whether students rate themselves high on academic beliefs and feelings? So we're going to see that one pop up first. And then folks can start to respond to that. And the second one will pop up, and we'll ask the same question, but this second one relates to how do students rate themselves in reference to their academic goals and behaviors. So Ron, whenever you're ready and want to clue us into the correct answer here.
So let's see here. Beliefs and feelings, 42% for care. And we do, beliefs and feelings, care is a strong predictor. Surprised, Captivate also tends to be a strong predictor on beliefs and feelings. Kids, when they're excited and really interested in the classroom, they're feeling happier, they're just more satisfied to be there. Now, efficacy as one of the beliefs and feelings is strongly predicted by challenge. Teachers who are challenging students, who are reminding them about the difficulties that they've worked their way through and insisting that they continue to persist in that way. So a lot of people check challenge, which is totally appropriate for the efficacy as one of the beliefs and feelings. But care and captivate tend to be consistently strong also on beliefs and feelings, particularly for happiness and sense of satisfaction. On the side of goals and behaviors, we talk about mastery orientation and effort. Clarify and challenge tend to make a big difference. And here we've got challenge. 57% of the folks check challenge. 28% checked control for goals and behaviors, but let me glance back. We don't very often find that control is that strong a predictor of the goals and behaviors. It's really more the quality of the instruction in terms of teaching so things are clear, pushing kids to really understand, getting them to persist. Now, there's an aspect of persistence that people may think intuitively as control. We include that with challenge. So some of the intuition that led lots of people to check control here, I think, may be captured by the persistence aspect of challenge, whereas the measures that we use for control are more students just being on task, staying busy, not wasting time, and behaving themselves. Not so much the focus on pushing themselves to really understand the material, which is more a matter of challenge. But I guess the point of this exercise, though, is just to remind us that all these things really matter. And what the things I've said for the last minute or so are just really pointing out the things that are the strongest predictors of goals and behaviors or beliefs and feelings. But everything is correlated. And the causal patterns that are behind this can be extremely complex. So it's hard to grab one of the C's and just emphasize it to the exclusion of the others, because they operate through one another, and we need to keep all these things in focus. There's some irreducible complexity here to work with. Here we'll just show you a little bit more on how the overall 7 C's composite is related to happiness, behavior, responses to social pressure, the things on this screen. And so if we think about these as being indices or aspects of just the quality of life in school, you want your kid to come home at the end of the day and say, I had a good day today. The question is that kind of experience at all related to the things we're measuring through the 7 C's as qualities of the classroom? And so here, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the horizontal axis here are quintiles of the 7 C's distribution. If you think about, remember when we talked about the responses, totally true down to totally untrue. If you think of, and actually we don't need to use that here. Let me rewind. We can take all the responses on any particular item in the classroom and put together an average for the entire class. And if you think about taking all the 7 C's and all the responses to all the 7 C's, we can come up with a single number for the classroom that is the summary number for that class on how the students have rated the classroom on the 7 C's. Then with using that number, we can rank order all the classrooms in any particular set of data. On the page we're looking at here, this is one urban school district where we had 1,260 secondary school classrooms that were surveyed. So we can rank order all those classrooms and how they were rated on the 7 C's. And then we can chop that rank ordering into 5 pieces to have quintiles. So the 1 on the horizontal axis represents those classrooms that were in the bottom 20% as rated by the 7 C's. Then we go to the second 20%, the third, the fourth, and the 5 represents the 20% that were rated in the top 20% according to the 7 C's. And then for each of those 5 groups, the first quintile, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, for each of those 5 groups, we can ask, how did the students rate their own happiness in those classrooms? We can also break that out and say, well, how did the kids who tend to get A-range grades rate themselves? And here the grades we've got on the screen now are the students' self-report of what their grade point average was at the end of the last term. So not in this particular class, but just overall, what kinds of classes did they get? And we can group them into groups that say, well, I tend to get A's, I tend to get B's, or I tend to get C's, or I tend to get D's. And here what we've done is we've graphed the relationship between their happiness and the way the classroom has been rated on the 7 C's by all the students taken together. And we see that no matter what students' grades are, they tend to be happier in classes that are rated higher on the 7 C's. Now, it is the case that students who get D-range grades have lower happiness than those who get C's, who have lower happiness than those who get B's, who have lower happiness than those who get A's. But despite the fact that there is some relationship of happiness to your general grade point average, the quality of instruction matters for everybody. And it's interesting that the slope of that line is pretty much the same for all the different groups. So the rate at which happiness improves as instruction improves is pretty much the same no matter what kinds of grades students get. Now on the next slide, we asked about students' self-reports of behavior. So under the engagement targets, there are self-reports about whether the student says, well, my behavior in this class kind of annoys the teacher. And we have a couple other ways of asking about whether they misbehave. And what we see here is that self-reports of misbehavior tend to go down. So as you move from left to right on the screen, as instruction improves according to the 7 C's, we get better and better behavior, except for the students who tend to get the lowest grades, the students who tend to get D's. And if anything, that line looks like it's probably upward sloped, which is telling us that we get in more reports of misbehavior from students who get low grades as the quality of instruction improves, which is maybe a bit unexpected, but if we think about that, imagine being a low achiever in a classroom where everybody else is becoming more and more focused on learning, and they're experiencing some success as they do that. But you're still struggling. Work is still hard for you. You don't want people to think you're stupid, so you decide to misbehave, distract them a bit more, so that they will attribute your lack of performance to a lack of effort and not a lack of ability. And so you can imagine the students who struggle feeling more conspicuous in classrooms that are more effectively focused on learning, and tending to misbehave more. And really, in order to overcome that, we need to differentiate effectively. We need to help those students not feel so at risk of being judged stupid, and instead to get the supports that they need in order to succeed and to feel as full-fledged members of the classroom community with appropriate support. So this theme of paying special attention to the emotional needs, in particular of the students who struggle, is a theme that we can follow up on and work on, particularly using the additional evidence that we get from the student engagement indices, which also, as I mentioned earlier, get at help avoidance and holding back and hiding effort and a number of behaviors that might be sort of accommodative behaviors to a student who is feeling emotionally insecure because of their struggles in the classroom. So this is kind of an interesting chart. So, but in any case, the last few charts, the point is that things are better in classrooms that rate higher on the 7 C's with regards to the ways that students are feeling and behaving in general. But there's still the question of, well, what about learning? Maybe they're feeling better, maybe they're behaving better, but are they actually learning more? And I've already kind of tipped my hat to you to tell you, yes, they do. But if we go back now to say a little bit more about the Gates project on measures of effective teaching, it's the most expansive project that the world has ever seen to measure and really define what effective teaching looks like. They use multiple measures. There were 5 or 6 different classroom observation rubrics applied. There were our tripod 7 C's to measure student perspectives. There were this value-added achievement gains. And there are actually a couple other things that were considered but not fully developed as part of the project. There were 6 districts involved, the ones that you see on the screen here: Charlotte, Dallas, Denver, Hillsborough County, Memphis, New York City. Teachers were chosen in matched 2s or 3s so that in each school you had the ability to assign students to classrooms, but then randomize which teacher was assigned to which classrooms. And there was analysis done as part of the MET project that really constitutes a random assignment evaluation to measure the relationships between both the observational rubrics and the student survey responses, the relationships of those to the value-added achievement gains. And the fact that teachers were randomly assigned to classes helps to really validate the conclusions reached concerning the validity of these measures as measures of achievement, because it was shown that each of the measures still tended to predict the others even after the randomization. And there's more methodologically I could say there, but I probably said enough to move on. So this is a statement from the first MET report. There were a few. They can all be downloaded from metproject.org over a period from late 2010 through early this year. There were a series of reports produced from the MET project. And again, www.metproject, all one word, metproject.org. All the reports are available for downloading there. The survey items that were used for the upper elementary and the secondary school student surveys are also posted there on the MET website. In any case, the statement here, two types of evidence, student achievement gains and student feedback, do seem to point in the same direction, with teachers performing better on one measure, tending to perform better on the other measures. And this was from the first report, the 2010, that focused mainly on the relationship between value-added achievement gains and the student survey responses. So, the findings on reliability. Methodologically, one of the things that was done was to break apart the measurement of the value-added achievement gains from the measurement of the student surveys in terms of which classrooms you measured them in. And actually, what I was about to say is not the point that's on the screen, so let me get back around to what I was about to say. The point that's on the screen now is that the correlations between classrooms of student survey results tend to be high. And actually for each of the measures, the observation measures and the value added, there are correlations between classrooms that are taught by the same teacher, but the student survey results tend to produce the strongest value added, the strongest correlations between classrooms. So I believe the correlations of the student survey composite between classrooms is in the range of 0.6, where the other measures are more in the range of 0.4 or so. The same teacher, different classrooms. Also, among the approaches that MET took was to use student survey results from one classroom to predict value-added achievement gains from a different classroom taught by the same teacher. And so if what students say in one classroom predicts how much students learn in a different classroom taught by the same teacher, that's telling us that student responses are picking up something that's stable within teacher, and it's going to be a characteristic of that teacher's instructional practice from one classroom to another classroom. So there are several things to say here, and it's probably too much for you to digest really quickly, but there's consistency across measures, there's consistency across classrooms, all of which give us a fair amount of confidence that these various measures are both valid and reliable. And again, you can read more about that in the MET reports. This is an example of how big the differences are between classrooms on the screen we're looking at now. If you take that's almost 3,000 classrooms and you rank order them by the composite of the 7 Cs. So again, we've got all the responses in a classroom on all the 7 Cs. We put those together to get one number that characterizes the entire classroom. We rank order all in this case, 2,985 classrooms. And then we pick off a couple places in that rank ordering. So imagine the 25th percentile in that rank ordering would be the position in the distribution where 25% of the people have that particular ranking or lower. And at that point in the distribution, we're at the 25th percentile, and the percentages of students who say at least mostly true to the items listed on the screen here are the percentages given in that first column of numbers. So at the 25th percentile point, 40% of the students in the classrooms at that point in the distribution would agree that it's at least totally true or mostly true, so at least mostly true, that my teacher in this class makes me feel that he or she really cares about me. If we move up to the 75th percentile position in the distribution, we're up to 73% of students agreeing that my teacher makes me feel that he or she really cares about me. And you realize this is just the top and bottom of the middle 50%. If you were to go out and compare the 10th percentile with the 90th percentile, you get even bigger differences. As we read down the screen here, without reading through every one, for example, number 5, captivate, my teacher makes learning enjoyable, you'll see 33 versus 72, and that's actually the biggest difference that we see on the page, is for whether the teachers make learning enjoyable. And we often find that of all the 7 C's, the ratings are lowest for making learning enjoyable. So we will with that, but let me move along. Now, the same difference between the 25th versus the 75th percentile points in that composite distribution, we can also ask, well, how much difference is there in what kids actually learn? And let's measure learning by how many months' worth of gains they had using value-added achievement gains. And we see on the state standardized math test, it was about half a year difference in how much mathematics students had learned at the 25th versus the 75th percentile of that distribution. The MET also used another test, the balanced assessment in math, which was not an accountability test. They wanted to see whether we get the same types of results when we use exams that are not part of any state's accountability system. And here we see 3.7 months, for almost 4 months worth of learning gain difference, even with the balanced assessment of math. Then for the English language arts, they used the state assessment, which is the first one there, the 2.3 months, and the Stanford 9 open-ended English language assessment, 2.9 months. So between 2 and 3 months a year difference, even for English language arts, depending upon whether you're at the 25th percentile point in how students rate teachers versus at the 75th percentile point in how students rate teachers. So bottom line, the student perceptions are valid and reliable indicators of how much students are going to learn on average in any particular classroom. Now again, I say on average because everything here, including the achievement gains, is measured with some error. So ideally over time, we want to use multiple deployments of any particular instrument to reach more and more firm judgments about the quality of what's happening in any particular teacher's classroom. And one of my favorite slogans these days is multiple measures, multiple times over multiple years. If we're using multiple measures, we're using them, deploying them multiple times per year, maybe 2 or 3 times, or even 4 times a year, but for surveys maybe twice. And we're doing that over multiple years. Then we're accumulating information that we can triangulate to reach a more reliable judgment about what's happening in classrooms. Sometimes we can't wait till we accumulate all that information before having reached some judgment, but the aspiration should be to have those judgments be more and more reliable over time by having them be based on more and more information. And we can also pay attention to trends so we can give folks credit for getting better and so on. So again, summary slide, student perceptions can help to predict learning outcomes and should be taken seriously by policymakers and educators, because without these kinds of evidence, we're just kind of making guesses, and there's a good chance that we get it wrong more often than we would get it wrong by taking advantage of the kinds of instruments that are now available to us, including observations, surveys, looking at student work, and so on. But the question now becomes, okay, how do we actually use this stuff? How do we bring it into the discourse in school systems. So the identification of priorities. The 7 C's, each of the 7 C's measures a distinct concept having to do with instruction. Statistically, we are most strongly able to distinguish 3 dimensions of support, and then challenge and control are actually separately identifiable as dimensions. So they're really those 3. And if we take just the support, we can identify additional subdimensions that align with the other 5 C's within support. And so they're kind of like peeling away layers of the onion in terms of the way we deal with the numbers. But even aside from the way we deal with the numbers, we can use the 7 C's as a way to shape the way we talk about instruction and the way we organize ourselves to address the need to improve instruction. And patterns in the data can help us to set priorities for professional development, and they can frankly help to put in place differentiated professional development. So there may be different levels of degrees of emphasis on different C's depending upon what the results have been for those particular C's. And we can do this distinguishing classrooms or schools or whole districts from one another. What we have on the screen now is 2 different, I've listed down the left side, the 7 C's indices, and then some of the engagement indices. So grit is really related to the persistence item that we talked about earlier, whether students persist in the face of difficulty. Then you have mastery, orientation, effort, happiness, help-seeking, sense of efficacy. And the 3 columns have to do with how the students rated the classroom on each of these dimensions. And you see we have a low, a moderate, and high ratings, just an arbitrary 3-way breakout. And I've taken 2 classrooms, A and B, and characterized them with regard to each of the indices. And we want to just pause for a minute to think about the stories of these 2 classrooms, what an observer might see, and the kinds of conclusions an observer might reach from looking at these 2 classrooms. And imagine that the observer is watching the classrooms but doesn't necessarily have access to the student survey results. But they're just watching classrooms that tend to have these features. What might pop out at the observer, and what kinds of conclusions might they reach? So Elizabeth, do you want to take over now for a minute?
Sure. So we're going to see another poll pop up. This one's going to be below the screen, so you can make sure you can take a look at the data that's on the screen. And we'd like to know which of these classrooms you think has the highest overall rating from an adult observer. Okay?
Yeah, we probably ought to give people 30 seconds or a minute to digest it.
Sure.
And remember that the observer is watching the class, and they see things what they see, but they don't see these survey results yet. And so you have to also think about what would an observer be able to see and not be able to see if they were just sitting in the classroom watching. And in the typical way that they do, dropping in for 15 or 20 minutes a few times a year, as opposed to sitting there every day with all the kids.
So it looks like the balance is tipping towards classroom A. Ron, do you want to share with us?
Yeah, is there another question that comes right after this that we should do before we discuss?
The next one is about a different set of It's actually a different question.
Okay, so let me talk about this one for a minute then. Yeah, and so we've got 61% of the folks that think that the highest overall rating will go to classroom A. And I noticed that changed after I said someone sitting there watching in the way somebody typically would, dropping in for 15 to 20 minutes several times a year. And I think your intuition is probably correct, but the thing that's easiest to see when you watch a classroom is whether it's under control, whether students are well behaved or not. What you can't see that easily is some of the more subtle things about instruction. So whether students are being challenged or not, whether things are being made interesting to them or not, whether students tend to be really focused on learning as much as they can or not. And so what we see here for classroom A is it's a classroom that's very much under control, and by the way, students tend to have a pretty high sense of efficacy. It's an orderly classroom where the kids are thinking, hey, we can do this. But is that really what we want if we look at the rest of the pattern here? Because we also see, if we look at the low column, it's a classroom where the students are not being challenged. And remember, challenge had two dimensions, persistence and rigor. So to think hard, really understand, not just memorize, to persist in the face of difficulty. The relationship with the teacher is one that's not very caring. So even though the students are behaving themselves, there's some chance that they're being intimidated into submission and they're behaving just because they're scared of the teacher, possibly. The instruction is not very interesting. Students don't feel that they necessarily persist in the face of difficulty, and they're not very focused on really mastering the learning. So the reason they feel so efficacious is that everything is pretty easy and that they're not stressed very much to learn, and as long as they behave themselves, they come away with the sense, hey, we can do this. And so the fact that they're under control is something that could distract us a bit from a deeper interrogation of what learning really looks like in that classroom. On the other hand, classroom B is one where there's probably a bit more chattering around the classroom. Students may not seem to be paying attention sometimes. There's maybe a little bit more disobedience. So it's a teacher who's got some classroom management issues, but who's above average on clarify and care, where when students don't understand something, this particular teacher can help clear up their confusion. And even though they don't behave themselves all the time, they know the teacher cares about them. And so that's a good thing. And then this teacher is moderate. They're toward the average on pretty much everything else. So they're not rating in the low category on any other categories. And probably because they can clarify and because they communicate caring, the level of help-seeking in the class is high. So you've got a class where a teacher is explaining things clearly. They're kind of average in the way that they challenge students. But when kids are confused, they ask for help. And one can guess that they're probably going to learn more than in classroom A. And they're probably also going to come away with a stronger love of learning and just a better overall feeling about school, even though on average here we're reporting that happiness in these two classes is roughly the same, although you might wonder, how can the kids be that happy in class B where they're just under control? I mean, did I just reverse some of what I said here? No, in class A, how can they be that happy in class A where they're under control and not really learning a whole lot? But in any case, every classroom will have some pattern. And when I talked earlier about finding the story of the classroom, you can just get a sense from the example I just talked through how two different classrooms can have two very different stories with two very different sets of implications for the kind of coaching support they might need and the things that the teachers might want to focus on in their efforts to improve.
So, Ron, that actually brings us to our next question. So we're interested in, this is the same table here, and we're just interested in hearing from people about if they were an instructional coach, how would this information be helpful in guiding the teachers of these two classrooms? So we'll ask folks to type in just a brief response to that question.
It looks like, go on, Elizabeth.
Okay, so it looks like we've gotten a lot of really great responses coming in. I don't know that it's necessarily the specifics of what people are saying, but the fact that there are really clear guidance for folks to look at with these teachers, so individualized, and the surveys help these coaches to hone in on specific needs that the teacher has. They're coming in really fast, these responses. So, Ron, feel free to jump in on anything you see.
Yeah, and you can imagine that there are, infinitely many different combinations in the results that teachers are likely to get. And we need, in order to respond effectively, we need to start to organize ourselves in schools to have really systems for processing these conversations and following up over time. I think we're at a turning point in American education where we're becoming much more serious now about using available data and using it and then monitoring to be sure that we're having the impact that we want to have by using it. And so I think people's comments have shown that it can be fairly clear in many cases where we need to focus, but there's also often a very big knowing-doing gap. And so even knowing where we need to focus doesn't mean we necessarily will. So as we think forward to using this kind of data, I just encourage people also be thinking hard about how we institutionalize the infrastructure through which we actually make sure we get it done in following up on this kinds of information. And you can also imagine if we focus, most of the folks here are focusing more on the C's. If we integrate in, you can imagine pretty rich conversations that bring in those engagement targets more explicitly, too.
I'd also bring up, too, that it could be overwhelming for a teacher or a coach to see all of this at once and to try to hone in on what's most important to deal with. So that's where, the local context has to come in and help people structure the priorities and decide, you know, what is my school or my district's priority at this moment in time, and, you know, how can I help this teacher reach those particular priorities?
Yeah, and some of the scaffolding and support is about helping people to scan a pattern and then decide where to hone it, where to dig in, where to focus more more deeply. People usually don't want somebody else to decide what little piece they get to see. People like to see more of the big picture. So a teacher probably wants to see, you know, the summary of all the results that came out of their classroom. But then someone needs to say, well, which of the things on the page here is the low-hanging fruit, is something where you think without making much change you could probably do better? Which things that concern you most, though, that may be places where you really want to focus in and maybe find some other teachers who have a similar focus and team up with them, or do some reading together and have some discussions, or poll your students informally at the end of each week to see whether you're improving in that particular dimension. So so there is complexity, but part of the leadership function is to help people to manage that complexity and to work through it and to move on. So the patterns that we were looking at a second ago were really patterns out of a couple of classrooms. We can also have patterns across whole schools and whole districts. We can drill down from having a single number. You can take all 7 of the C's and slurp them into one single number for the entire district. So, and we have a few different ways of expressing that. We can have a favorability rating for an entire district, or an NCE rating for an entire district. And then we could say, well, what about the schools within that district? Or what about the grade levels within those schools, or the classrooms within those grade levels, or the certain types of students? The students who have D-range GPAs in 9th grade math classes, what are they telling us about their own engagement? So you can drill down in ways that can tailor the discourse that you build off of the observations. So I'm going to move past this one. The screen here is a screen from one urban school district where we looked at 48 secondary schools. I should bring in more elementary schools in here. We have more of those too, but sorry, they're not too much represented here. So you'll see the color coding is for favorability ratings. Favorability on any particular item is, like I said earlier, it's at least mostly true. If it's positively worded, or it's mostly untrue or totally untrue if it's negatively worded. But red means that fewer than 25% of the students, on average, responded favorably. Dark green is 75% or more. Each of these on this particular screen is a whole school. As we'll see in a minute, most of the variation is within school. Schools do differ from one another, as you can see from this screen, but there's much more variation within school across classrooms than there is if we're comparing school averages and looking across schools as we are on this particular screen. So, for example, we could decide that we want to look at the school that has the lowest overall ratings on the 7 C's. That's the line 1 here. And when we look inside that school, we see this. So inside this particular school, we see not much dark green. There are only 3 dark green slots on the entire page. And we go back to the question on the page before, but I need to describe this slide first. And there's a lot of red. And I guess pink maybe, I suppose, is the 25% to 39% category. But this is a single school that has got a few classrooms that look pretty good, but it's the lowest rated school in the entire district. And here we see the profile. So the previous slide posed a question about that particular school. Elizabeth?
Okay, so this is in reference to the data. We're going to pop that slide back up so you can refer to it. But we'd like to know, given that data on the lowest rated school, what priorities would you set to design an instructional improvement strategy? So similar to the last question, just looking at the data on this particular school, what would be the priorities?
And we can frame that as priorities, or what would even the general approach. If you're at central administration and you look at a school that's got this profile and you're working out of the superintendent's office, what is the conversation? What is it you're going to talk about? There is a question that's come up about anonymity. I'll address it in a moment rather than wait much longer to get to it. So we'll finish what we're doing now, then I'll say a few words about the anonymity question.
So Ron, one of the comments that is coming in is in reference to creating that base knowledge about the 7 C's and how that's foundational to understanding where the strengths and weaknesses are. In your experience, what foundational knowledge do folks get about the 7 C's prior to administering the surveys?
None. The 7 C's are things that teachers ought to normally be attending to in the course of their instruction. So the first time the surveys are done, teachers have been given no preparation to know what they're going to cover at all, because we want to get a clean baseline on what instruction looks like. We don't want them to start trying to teach to the survey before the first time through. After they've taken the survey, the actual form on which they get their classroom level results on it has some coaching on how they can begin to process and think carefully about each of the C's. It has a set of questions to ask themselves about how they respond to particular events or situations or in their own classrooms. And so these are prompts to get the juices flowing, and that can also be the focus of small group conversations. And then different districts can organize in whatever ways they find most appropriate to focus more on the C's. And I think one of the important things is that conversation needs to be carefully integrated with whatever pre-existing ways there are in a district for talking about instruction. Because the effective schools and effective districts have clear language for talking about instruction. It's not so important that it's any particular vocabulary for talking about it, as it is important that it is an identifiable, clear, and coherent way of talking about it that people can come together around. But that is the basic answer, and folks can follow up with more detail on that. Elizabeth, should I say something about the anonymity question while we're waiting for people to finish typing?
Sure.
Yeah.
For folks who didn't see that on the left, David asked a question about whether the surveys are anonymous and do they capture student-specific data.
Yeah. the surveys are absolutely always anonymous for students. And so no information is ever returned to a district on how any particular student answered, and there have to be at least 5 students in a classroom for any classroom level data to be distributed. In some places even go up to 10 students for any classroom level data to be returned. So there are student identifiers a lot of the time when we can. Actually, the students, the survey comes to students with a peel-off label that has their name on it. And under that label or near that label, there's a barcode that can be used at the printer to match student information to other types of information. But none of that information that's identifiable at the student level is given back to schools. There are a few districts that have sufficient research capacity to do some of their own analyses with some of these kinds of data. That is the exception rather than a rule. But even there's great care taken that no student-level data is ever returned to a school in a way that's identifiable, to get the students identifiable. Now, at the teacher level, the first administration, and maybe more than the first administration, is almost always anonymous at the teacher level. So nobody in the district is given information that allows them to identify a teacher. At some point in time, particularly when these data are going into evaluation numbers, somebody in the district has information that can be identified at the teacher level. And at that point, it's really important for it to be used in a very discrete way. So districts need systems in place to manage that. This question about whether it affects validity, you can imagine teachers over time starting to try to influence the ways that their students respond to these items, particularly if the teachers know that some fraction of their evaluation rating is coming off of the surveys. The only district that currently already does that is Memphis, where they use 5% of the evaluation performance reflects the student survey responses. It's 5%. It's not going to make that much difference, but it gets people's attention to start to focus on this. But if we think about the way that people might try to influence the student responses, one way is by trying to teach better, is by trying to actually clarify more effectively or challenge students more effectively or keep the classroom under better control. And that's not necessarily invalidating the survey. That's the kind of response that we want. The worry we would have about the validity would be if teachers are trying to get students to not tell the truth, or if students themselves get wind of the idea that some of this is being used for teacher evaluations and they start to try to skew their responses for some reason. There's not been much in the way of using these kinds of surveys with high stakes, and so we really don't have a research base yet to know that, but we are thinking hard about ways to put checks in place, including something as simple as having a couple questions on the survey to just ask students straight up, are your responses to the survey your true beliefs as you believe them? And I don't even remember right this minute exactly how we posed those, but they're posed in a pretty benign way to just ask students, are you telling the truth? But there are also ways to look for patterns. We can look to see if there's too much variation or too little variation, both within student and across students. And so as these are used for evaluation purposes, we will need, and we're really at the very beginning of that process, to have just standard checks that we do to at least rate each classroom on the likelihood that there's been some inappropriate influence on the way the students are responding. But that is an important issue, and we'll be paying attention to it.
Ron, I'm just going to mention two quick things from some of the comments I saw that came in here, and then I think we'll need to move along pretty quickly so that we don't run out of time. But one of the things I noticed people were focusing on is the piece about relationship building and emphasizing that domain of care.
Yeah.
And getting this teacher in particular to take a look at that and ways to increase that care and engagement in the classroom. But another really interesting thing I noticed was a comment related to PLC makeup, and I think that it's a great point, and I don't know if you have any experience with this, but if we're looking at data across a school and we're able to see where teachers show strengths and weaknesses in designing our PLC groups to ensure diversity would be an excellent way to allow folks to share, what they're good at with teachers who may not be so strong in the same area.
Yep. Really good school principals are really skilled at how they put the groups together, who they put in which groups. There's one change process where a teacher took all the naysayers, all the whiners in her school and put them all in the same group so that the other groups could get work done. But mixing together people who have fared very differently or who the principal might suspect may have fared very differently on these kinds of things is an appropriate way to proceed to structure these kinds of things. On the care and engagement piece, I think it's just important to remember that engagement is about much more than a simple notion of caring. And probably the most effective thing a teacher can do to persuade a kid that he or she really cares is to really understand that child deeply as a learner so that the teacher's instructional responses are appropriately scaffolded and tailored to that particular student as often as possible. Care is not simply about being nice. And teachers often, when people start talking about care, often the adults will assume you're talking about being nice. And nice is important if our main priority is making sure the students are happy. And of course, we do care about students being happy. But I encourage people not to focus on just one of the C's. What adults usually do, almost no matter what you tell an adult, they will assume that you're basically confirming what they already thought. And so if there's somebody who thought that classroom management was key, there's a risk that they will take everything I've said today and look at it as confirmation that classroom management matters. If it's somebody who thought that teacher relationships and caring is what really mattered the most, they'll interpret everything I've said today to mean that caring really is what matters the most. And I just encourage everybody who's listening to try to be sure that you aren't just taking what I'm saying as confirmation, but are actually looking for places where I'm pointing out things that might not align with what you already thought. Control, for example, being the strongest predictor is not what anybody thought. Nobody checked that one off on the poll. But then some of the things you did check off are things that might affect control. And so particularly clarify. So just thinking that stuff through in a careful way is important.
So Ron,
now, Elizabeth,
I know we'd like to get into this one, but unfortunately we're sort of running out of time. So I think in the interest of time and making sure we have ample opportunity for people to ask questions at the end, let's just skip that high school.
Okay, and so this was the highest rated high school. And you'll see there's a lot more dark green and a lot less red, but there's some red even in the highest rated school. Lots of variation in every school, lots of need for differentiated professional development in every school. So some things to keep in mind just at the end of all this. Some of it harks back to what I was saying a minute ago. Value added is really something that we care a lot about. A lot of the emphasis these days is shifting to value added. And control is a strong predictor of value added. But we also care about whether students are happy, whether they're inspired, whether they're inclined to develop a love of learning. And so this slide is intended to just remind us that we have multiple outcomes that we care about, and we want to take each one seriously, but not have any one become the exclusive focus. And to the extent that there are multiple outcomes, different elements of classroom practice are important for predicting different outcomes. Happiness is predicted strongly by captivate and care, which have very little predictive power for value added. Value added is predicted strongly by challenge and control, which have very little predictive power for happiness and inspiration, for example. So that's it. Second one, as I was saying a minute ago, it really is truly multidimensional. So it's not unusual after a talk I've given for somebody to come up and say, you've just proven what I've always known. It really is about relationships, isn't it? Or they'll say, it really is all about having high expectations, isn't it? And again, maybe it is, but make sure that what you mean by those statements is sort of this more complex combination of things and not just one aspect of it. Then leadership at the school level and at the district level. Most of what we've talked about today has been focused on classrooms and how students respond to classrooms. But if we're trying to affect what goes on in classrooms, if we're trying to help students and teachers have better teaching and learning experiences, then we've got to affect those experiences from higher levels in the system, which means we really have to focus on what the structures and activities, practices, beliefs are at the school and district level, and even above the district level at times. And then finally, there's measurement error in everything we've talked about. Using multiple measures multiple times over multiple years can help to average out that that measurement error, can help us to develop increasingly reliable judgments and therefore increasingly appropriate responses to what we've seen. So Elizabeth, your turn.
All righty. So now we've really spent a lot of time looking at some data and having folks kind of analyze that. Now we want people to take a look at their own context, their own school or district, and think about all the things you've heard today and kind of think about how you can apply that and what action step or steps might you plan to take as a result of what you've heard today. What you share may help another person that's listening and really help people think about what can be done in their schools or districts.
Elizabeth, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Is in terms of people posing questions, that'll come after what you just asked them?
Yep, we're going to have a question and answer session in just a minute after we go through this piece.
Okay.
So Elise's role is to support new teachers, and she's saying that this will give her a lot of ideas to offer to new teachers especially.
Yep.
Oh, and a state administrator looking to use student surveys. Multiple times, multiple years. I like what you said about that, Ron.
Yep.
I think that will be a catchphrase for several folks now.
I mean, we can use, in terms of using them for professional development and improvement, I mean, even one deployment gives you information that you can use to influence the conversations and the efforts. But the higher the stakes are, then the more sure you want to be, and that's where you get more into the multiple deployments and the multiple measures.
So I see a comment about getting buy-in and ensuring that folks understand the purpose of the 7 C's and how it can be used for transformation.
Yeah. And there, it's partly a matter of people being assured that you're not going to use these to beat them up right quick, that it's going to be safe, and then just having a few examples that make it clear this isn't just a worthless use of classroom time. I mean, one of the responses before people have any sense that the data are going to be used for improvement is that you just took some of their classroom time. But if we think about the amount of time that this takes, it's trivial in relationship to the amount of time that our state exams take. And we can at least speculate that the value of this for helping to improve is at least as strong as the value of the state exams are. It takes much less time. And one of the other standard responses to the time thing is that we do ask students about whether the class stays busy and doesn't waste time. And we do not get terribly high levels of agreement with that statement. So it appears that the vast majority of classrooms have some slack and can maybe just use some other time a bit more efficiently to make up for the time that this takes. But it's a learning experience for all of us. And as people start to work with the additional understandings, it's pretty certain that the time is worth it.
All right, I see just a few more comments coming in, but I think, again, in the spirit of time, we do want to have some time for questions. So we'll move along from that, but I do encourage people to continue thinking about what action steps you take. I think we're entering a time of reflection with the school year ending and thinking about what will happen in the next coming school year with a lot of change happening in a lot of places, with the Common Core taking hold and new assessments coming on. It's a time that people can really step back and think about what can we do, what new ways can we look at getting information about our schools and our districts. So I think it's great that people have some great concrete ideas which to go forward. Ron, do you want to just share a little bit about your contact information and where people can learn more about the project?
Yeah, I mean, there's at tripodproject.org, there are at least one or two names and phone numbers and email addresses at Cambridge Education for folks to ask additional questions. There are also some additional things that you can read there. Luckily, for a number of years now, I have not been an active part of the working on the logistics. I tend to specialize in the survey development and the analysis and so on. So if there is a question that's got to do with the researchy kinds of things, I'm probably the person to contact. My Harvard email address is just Ronald_Ferguson@harvard.edu. If you don't write that down, you can just Google my name and put Harvard next to it. It'll take you to a site that has my contact information on it.
Yeah, Ron, we have that actually on one of our upcoming slides as well.
Oh, you do? Okay.
And I also want to just mention here, too, Ron, I'm not even sure if you were aware, but Rob Ramsdell, who is also involved in the Tripod Project, will be one of our presenters in the fall. So as you make plans to participate in our future webinars, he'll be speaking on using classroom observations to think about teacher effectiveness. So it will relate somewhat to this presentation, but it will go into more detail on classroom observations. So now we're going to jump into our Q&A session, and we did get quite a few questions in our box down in the left hand side, but we also got several questions prior to the webinar when people were registering. So we will begin to think about answering some of those, but we'll also pop up the Q&A box so that folks can ask any new questions they have, and we'll give Ron a chance to respond to those.
Yeah, I see David has a question about the alignment to the Danielson framework. That paper is for an edited volume that a lot of the people who contributed instruments to the MET project are producing. I'm doing one chapter that combines with the Danielson framework and another that combines with the New Teacher Project's teacher survey. On the Danielson one, there will be a chapter, I hope, within 2 weeks. If you want to be a reader and give me comments, you can email me and I can share it with you in exchange for you give me any comments on it. So it will be in the book, but you can have access to it, I think, before that. I won't try to summarize anything right now that's coming out of it, but there is a degree of alignment, and there are useful ways to use the frameworks together. As I was saying earlier, the student surveys are a bit more reliable, but each instrument does have some informational value that the other doesn't, and so bringing them together is a good thing.
Ron, I see a question related to
the 25th, 75th percentiles.
Yeah.
Okay. If we think about each classroom has, let's say a classroom has 20 students in it. Every student answers, let's say a secondary school student is going to answer 35 items having to do with the 7 C's. It's answering every item on a scale of 1 to 5. Imagine adding up all the ratings that all the students in the whole class have given on all the items. Okay? So 5 times 35 times 20 might be how many ratings. So you're going to add all those things up, and you get one number that represents how all of the students collectively rated that classroom. And every class will have its own number. Now imagine, you give the teacher a ticket that's got the number on it from their class. And now you send all the teachers out to line up in the order of the number on their ticket. So one end you have the teacher who's got the lowest rating from their classroom. At the far other end you've got the teacher who got the highest rating from their classroom. Now you've got a ranking in it that's got almost 3,000 teachers. And so you want to go now 25% of the way up from the bottom end of that distribution. Okay, 25% of the way up from the bottom end of that distribution is going to be the 25th percentile person. The teacher is the 25th percentile, and that teacher will have not only the way that their students had rated them, but also some evidence from value-added achievement gains. So we'll have a measure of how much students in that class learned. And we can translate that into a certain number of months worth of learning that the student has achieved maybe by the spring. Then we can keep going up through the distribution until we get to the place where we've now passed by 75% of the teachers. So we're at the 75th percentile position in the distribution. And at that position, whatever teacher standing there also has a certain number of months worth of learning that the students have achieved. And we could compare that number with the number that was down at the 25th percentile. And what we talked about earlier is it's 4.8 months difference in math instruction if we're talking about math learning, if we're talking about middle school mathematics, for example. It's almost half a school year difference in how much students have learned. We make similar comparisons for English language arts. It's between 2 and 3 months worth of difference in how much students have learned. Okay, and so we're distinguishing teachers based upon how their students rated them instructionally, and then given those distinctions, holding that constant, we ask, what are some other things that differ between those same teachers? And we're finding that how much students learned also differed. And the page before the one that showed how much they learned, that had the 4.8 months on it, there was the one that showed you the levels of agreement with those 7 items that were listed on the page for that 25th percentile classroom versus the 75th percentile classroom there. So I hope that works. The question is, was that academic achievement levels? That was on the measures there were the statewide standardized tests. So in Massachusetts, it's the MCAS. and you can translate the MCAS scores and really the change from one year to the next into months worth of learning. If in technical terms we start off with standard deviation level effect sizes, and then you can do various comparisons to find out how many months corresponds to a particular fraction of a standard deviation.
Thanks, Ron, for clearing that up. I'm sure Diana wasn't the only one who had a question on that.
Yep.
Another one, which is probably more complex than you can really address here, but I know people are interested in the application of this information to teacher evaluations.
Right.
So one of the questions we got was how much weight, if any, would be applied to teacher evaluations? And maybe you can just talk more generally about...
Well, I mean, Memphis uses 25%. Well, not 25, 5%. So the Memphis formula has in it student value added, the scores from supervisors or other adults who have watched the classroom and given it a rating, and the student survey ratings from the tripod 7Cs. And that student survey rating is 5% of the total in Memphis. I think I know what percentages each of the others are, but since I'm not absolutely positive, I won't say. Another district has talked about using 15% for the student survey. There's no absolute right answer, and it really depends upon what criteria one is using to decide. I mean, one criteria is reliability, and on that dimension, the student survey rates pretty strongly. On the other hand, though, just the receptivity and the degree to which we want the indices that go into the evaluation to be indices around which it's easy and convenient to have coaching discussions. And so something like the observational frameworks like Danielson's or others can, where the rating came from an adult, it may be that the teachers may be more receptive. Some of those have a lot of supporting material that defines very nuanced aspects of teaching that are really useful. So it's both about the particular metrics themselves by themselves, but it's also about the complementarity between particular metrics and the more social processes of adult interaction are relevant here. Again, how you can actually use this in conversations between various adults in the district. And now Jesse's saying, biggest fear is the students tend to have a slightly immature view of what constitutes effective teaching. We don't ask students what constitutes effective teaching. If you look at the items, we ask students about whether their teacher accepts anything less than their best effort. So my teacher accepts nothing less than our best effort, or my teacher really wants us to understand, not just memorize, or my teacher has lots of good ways of explaining each topic we cover, or my teacher makes learning interesting, or my teacher wants to know what students think about things. We're asking students for descriptive indicators of what's happening in the classroom. And our experience is the students actually enjoy answering these questions because they're not used to people asking them these kinds of things. And they tend to answer in very systematic ways. And so even in classrooms where they pretend that they're blowing it off, they're usually not blowing it off, and we can check that by just looking at patterns in their responses. We very seldom get the patterns for a classroom where it looks like the students did not take the survey seriously. My favorite statement is a kid who said, well, I started to just blow it off, but then I felt stupid, so I just went on and did it the right way. And so it's true that you might have this fear, but our general finding is that fear is not very well founded when it comes to these surveys.
We've now come to the end of our webinar, but the conversation isn't over. In fact, it may be just beginning. Please complete the evaluation form following today's webinar. Your feedback will help us improve future webinars. I'd like to invite you to use the REL Mid-Atlantic website as a hub for continuing the conversation. There are some great resources listed there as well, including links to material from the What Works Clearinghouse. And for webinar participants in the REL Mid-Atlantic region, you'll also find links to state coordinators. You can contact them for assistance or more information about the REL. Thanks again for joining us today.